there is something like an emergent ethic that's evident in biological systems. And one of the most outstanding examples of that, I would say, is apart from the work that Dewall has done with chimpanzees, showing the beginnings of an ethic, at least in the behavioral sense, the beginnings of an ethic among chimpanzees is work that's been done with rats. And so Jaak Panksepp, for example, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which I would highly recommend. It's a real work of genius.
You blew my mind with Piaget, by the way, with the way that rats...
No, that's Panksepp. That
wasn't
Panksepp.
Piaget?
No, Piaget found that out in children. So Panksepp was the scientist who discovered that rats laugh.
That's right.
And you think, well, that's not a big deal. It's like, actually, it is a really big deal because it shows commonality of the positive emotion systems across biological strata, essentially. So it's actually a really big deal. And he found that if you tickle rats with an eraser, they laugh ultrasonically.
Yeah.
And so you have to slow it down to hear them. And the reason he figured that out was because he was trying to figure out why, if you take rat pups away from their mother and feed them and give them enough water, they still die. So they die unless you massage them with, well, he used a pencil eraser. That's what, because it's kind of soft, it seems to work without harming the rats, little rat pups. And if you rub them with pencil eraser, then they'll thrive. And that was actually translated very rapidly into practical research, because it turns out that if you have a premature infant, it's in an incubator, they often lose weight, which is a really bad thing because they're supposed to be gaining weight. But if you massage them 3 times a day for 10 minutes, then they'll gain weight about as fast as they do in utero. And they leave the hospital on average 5 days earlier. And the beneficial cognitive and physiological effects are still detectable 6 months down the road. It's a walloping effect. And so it turns out that one of the things Panksepp sorted out was that the touch is a human need. It's not a secondary need, it's a primary need like food and water.
And childhood development.
Yeah. Well, and he was also a big proponent of rough and tumble play, because he found out that in rats, that rough and tumble play, especially among juvenile males, catalyzes prefrontal development, and that rat pups who are male that aren't allowed to engage in rough and tumble play show prefrontal hypodevelopment, and you can then treat them with Ritalin, which is the ADHD drug, just in case you're wondering. So that's a very dismal line of scientific research, but also very promising. So what Panksepp also found, and this is another piece of information that really blew me away when I first read about it, was so Panksepp discovered the play circuitry in mammals. And that's also a big deal, right? That's like discovering a continent. And to discover a dedicated circuitry to a set of complex biological functions, that's a big deal, man. And so when he was investigating play behavior among rats, he noticed that juvenile males in particular would work to wrestle. And they wrestle really a lot like, well, human children, or like human children and dogs wrestle. And rats pin each other. So what Panksepp found first was that, and other scientists as well, but I'll use him as a shorthand, was that rats would work to enter a play arena where they knew they were going to be allowed to wrestle with a peer. And that's kind of how you figure out if a rat wants to do something, right? You make him button press for it or pull on something, and then you can measure how fast he'll press the button or how hard he'll pull, and you can get some estimate of how motivated he is. And rats are pretty damn motivated to enter into a play arena. And so if one rat enters into a play arena and another rat does, and the one rat is 10% bigger than the other, then in like 9 out of 10 cases, the big rat can pin the little rat. And in the first bout, then pinning establishes dominance. This is kind of an interesting commentary on scientific methodology too, because let's say that you were investigating rat behavior and you were trying to draw conclusions and you only paired rats together once. You'd assume the big rat dominates, it's physical size that does the domination, and that's the purpose of play. But that isn't right, because play...
It's gotta let it win every once in a while.
Well, play is something that iterates, right? You don't play with a person only once. You play with them, well, who knows for how long, right? If it's a relationship that lasts decades, then it's decades of reciprocal interaction. So Panksepp and his colleagues and the other scientists who were working on this paired the rats repeatedly. So these are iterated games. And the rules of an iterated game aren't the same as the rules of a one-off game. And that might actually be the basis for a universal ethic, is that there are rules for iterated games. And what Panksepp found was that, okay, so the big rat is now superordinate to the little rat. Now when you repair them, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play. That's the rule. So the big rat gets to sit there like he's cool, and the little rat has to hop up like a dog that's asking you to play and sort of bounce around. You all know what that looks like. Dog kind of puts its rear end up in the air, kind of hops a little bit, and that means like, well, come on, human, cuff me, you know? And if you have any sense, you know how to do that. And you can even understand when a dog does it. And the dog, if he's socialized, can understand when you're doing it, right? Because a well-socialized dog is, you kind of go like this, and then he does the same thing, and you whack him on the side of the head a little bit, and he growls and puts his, your hand in his mouth, but he doesn't bite it, but he sounds like he's going to. The dog knows what the hell's going on, unless it's raised by a behavioral psychologist, which is... Anyways, the worst behaved dog I ever saw was a dog that was raised by a behavioral psychologist. So anyway, sorry about that. But so you pair these rats together, and what you find is that, so the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, and the big rat will break his cool and then wrestle. And then if you pair them repeatedly, unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will no longer ask him to play. Like, and I read that, it was like, little electrical storm went off in my brain.
That is what happened to me too.
Well, it's so good, so absolutely unbelievable is that, well, there you have it, it's emergent ethic of reciprocity. Yeah. All you need to do is pair animals together in reciprocal play bouts, and you have an emergent reciprocity. And then you think, well, okay, so that's the basis for social interaction, is that reciprocity. There's a bit of an advantage to the big rat, but not a huge advantage. Say, well, that's the beginning of an ethic. And you say, well, human beings, that ethic emerged at the biological level, and then human beings watched it develop and told stories about it. That's where the stories came from. And then out of the stories, we coded an explicit ethic. And that's where the philosophy of ethics came from. But it emerged from the bottom up. Something Nietzsche predicted like 150 years ago. He said, well, we'll find that there was an emergent ethic that emerged biologically and then was later mapped. And so that was just, well, that's just absolutely beyond belief. Yes. And then very likely true, and points the way to something like, well, an archetypal ethic, certainly one of reciprocity, which is I think, the fundamental archetypal ethic. It's like, well, here's another example.
Jordan, maybe just because we want to touch on a bunch of other points as well. We're amazingly in depth in this. This is so cool.
Well, universal ethic is important, as it turns out.
Exactly.
Let me tell just a brief story.
Okay.
All right, because this is also extremely important because it shows where the classical economists are wrong.
Brief story.
Brief.
Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I know. It's not likely. So let's play a trading game. Okay, so you two can play this trading game. So here's the deal. It's very simple. I'm going to give you $100. I'm not, actually, but I'm going to give you $100, and you can offer some of it to your partner in the game. But the rule is if she says no, you don't get anything, and neither does she. And you only get to make one offer. So, okay, here's your $100. How much are you going to offer her? 40. Okay, would you take 40? Okay, now that's interesting.
Wow.
Okay, very good. That's perfect. Okay, so first of all, the classic economist would say you should offer her $1. Why? Well, because she might as well take $1 because she gets $1.
Yeah.
And you want to maximize your own return, so you get $99. It's like, what happens when you do that? What happens is that is never what people do. They usually offer approximately 50%.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then the other person refuses.
Yeah.
Now, then you might think, well, let's say you matched a rich person and a poor person, and you said, okay, give the rich person 100, and they offer the poor person $1. What does the poor person say? You think, well, yeah, I need the dollars. They say, no, go to hell. I'm not doing it. And they're more likely, the poor person is more likely to refuse the lower offer than a rich person is. Running completely contrary to the predictions of classical economists. You play that game across the world, it's pretty much 50-50. And that's so interesting because it's another example of that emergent ethic. It's like, well, part of the reason you'd say no, and why no is correct, is because you don't play one trading game. You play a lifetime of trading games. And the right answer to the question of how to play a lifetime of trading games is to not settle for less than 50%. But you could also make a case that if you're the giver rather than receiver, if you're playing an iterated game, you might want to offer $60 because especially if your reputation is being broadcast. Because let's say your goal isn't to get $40, which is what you'd be left if you offered 60. Your goal is to let everybody know that if they play with you, you give them 60 and you get 40. And then what happens is like, well, let's take a vote on who wants to play with who. It's like, you want to play with the person who offers you 10, or do you want to play with the person who offers you 60? And then the person who's a little more generous than reciprocal, 50-50 would be reciprocal, maybe you should err on the side of generosity. Why? Well, easy. People will line up to play with you. So then the question is, do you want to win the game, or do you want to win the set of games? Mm-hmm. Right. And I think there's rules that govern the set of all possible games. And it's the rules that govern the set of all possible games that constitute something like an emergent ethic. So anyway, so that's a very useful thing to know. It's a very useful thing to know.
It is. So, can you give a couple quick ones of those potential universal ethics that govern the set of games?
Well, I think that's the big one. I think the big one is you approximate reciprocity, but it would be better. It'd be better if you can figure out how to. I think it's reciprocity with erring on the side of generosity, because there's just no downside to that in an iterated game. It's like, I'm going to borrow. What I do when I grade papers with students, for example, is I grade them and then I add 5%. It's like, well, maybe I made a mistake, so I'll err on the side of generosity, right? And why not do that in your reciprocal interactions? That doesn't mean you're letting people take advantage of you, right? It's not a matter of weakness in your negotiating strategy, because there's no excuse for that. That's a losing game, that. But if you could take 50% or 70% and you decide to be generous, it's like, well, you still have to be awake so that you're not being messed about with by people who are a little bit on the psychopathic end. You don't want to be foolish about it. But reciprocal plus generous, that's a hell of a good start. So
can we quick dive into science and God? Because I want to
not quick.
Let's try. So let's try. Can science sufficiently consistently self-actualize humans?
Well, okay.
Because with God, with religion, people find some sort of self-actualization. Can science be a source of self-actualization or morality?
Not the way that we normally construe science. Like, if you look at, let's make that concrete for a minute. When I teach my students my personality class, and we concentrate a fair bit on clinical theories because I'm a clinician, one of the things I make clear to them is that neither medicine nor clinical psychology are sciences. They're variants of engineering. They're attempting to build something. There's an end in mind. There's an ethical end in mind, right? I mean, what you do when you're a clinical psychologist is try to help people make their lives better. Now, you might say, well, you're trying to make them more mentally healthy. But actually, that's a weaker description than that you're trying to make their lives better. Because sometimes, as a clinical psychologist, you see people who are, they're normal in their health, but they would like their lives to be better. There's an up, obviously, and that introduces the ethical realm. And you might be able to use scientific techniques in order to determine which of the strategies you use to try to make your life better are working. But it's not obvious that you can use scientific principles to decide what constitutes better to begin with. That's a big problem. I don't see any evidence that you can.
Well, how about...
Because science excludes morality from its purview at the methodological level.
Well, okay, let's take an example of cancer and science solving suffering by providing solutions to cancer.
Yeah, well, should you devote money to cancer education? That's where the problems start to come, is that you can't make an a priori decision. You can't make an informed decision about where the scientific attention should focus itself. It's not an easy thing to do. At some point, the decisions have to be, they're either arbitrary or they're made by techniques that seem to be outside of the scientific purview. Let me give you an example. So I read this book by an ex-KGB agent who had detailed out some of the extent of the Soviet biological warfare program back in the 1980s. And one of the things the Soviet scientists were trying to do, according to this guy, was to weaponize infectious biological agents, which actually turns out to be harder than we suspected, thank God. And what they were trying to do was cross smallpox with Ebola. And it's because Ebola's like seriously fatal, and smallpox is seriously contagious. And so they thought, well, seriously fatal plus seriously contagious, it's like, what could be better than that?
Recipe for disaster.
Right. And so, and you might say, well, is crossing Ebola with smallpox, is seeing whether you can cross Ebola with smallpox a reasonable scientific question, an appropriate scientific question? And purely from the perspective of science, yes. Because science is a generic problem-solving mechanism. Now, you might say, well, no, it's not something any reasonable human being should ever engage in, but that's not the same thing as asking whether or not it's a question within the reasonable purview of science. I mean, the thing about science is that science was designed to be as value-free a methodology as possible. It's designed for that. And so then people say, well, why is there a gap between science and values? It's like, well, because it's built into the methodology. So it looks to me like you need something that's outside of science to direct the ethic. And it seems to me that that's something like stories. Well, it can't come from within science. I don't see how. I mean, partly because you exclude the value.
Isn't the story of the cosmos already enough to get someone excited enough to find some sort of value system from the being born from the stars and that being inspirational?
No, not necessarily, because you can just as easily say, well, here we are in this little dirt ball in the middle, on the outer edge of this galaxy that's going to rotate pointlessly for the next 250 million years, a couple of dozen billion years before the heat death of the universe. It's like, that's pretty dismal accounting of the utility of life. I mean, you know what I mean? You can take
we're taking it from
you have that entire range of interpretive possibilities from isn't life remarkable and wonderful, and to isn't it bloody pointless if you look at it from the wrong temporal perspective.
I think you can find that from science.
Well, yeah, but you can also find the reverse. So that's the problem. I'm not anti-scientific.
Yeah,
but
of course.
I don't see a simple way of solving the problem of the ethical direction of the scientific inquiry. I mean,
what comes to mind maybe as a way to get to that area?
Well, one of the things that I talked about in detail with Sam Harris, and we're going to talk about this some more because it's by no means solved, is the relationship between facts and values. And the old idea, Hume's idea, is you can't derive values from a set of facts. And I think that's sort of right, but I kind of think it's more complicated than Hume thought it was, but I'm not exactly sure why. Because I made a case earlier about this emergent ethic arising out of iterated games. That kind of looks like a scientific observation about the origin of morality. It's something like that. So it's not like science can't inform your moral decisions, but exactly how that might come about is by no means a straightforward issue. And I mean,
fascinating.
Well, it's also not the case. It is also not self-evident that science has served a beneficial function for human beings. It might be the case. It could be the case. I mean, look, we're pretty comfortable here, and thank God, and that's definitely a consequence of the scientific revolution. But
you just highlighted your phone as a major...
Yeah, but one good hydrogen bomb blown up over North America would set us back about 50,000 years, and that could easily happen. If I was a paranoid dictator, that's certainly what I would do. And I don't know, you guys, most of you guys probably know what would happen if you blow up a hydrogen bomb. I think it's about 150 miles up, something like that. One, you get an electromagnetic pulse, it takes all the electronics out, all of them. Right. One bomb. And so, maybe we'll manage that, but it wouldn't. And, maybe we'll manage that transition to whatever we're going to do next, but I wouldn't count on it. And so, it isn't even necessarily the case that scientific endeavor is a pro-human life process.